As I get older, my hands remind me more and more of my father's hands. I didn't really think about him much when he was alive and don't remember seeing him till he was a fully grown man. I never saw the boy's hands who, as a wide receiver, caught passes for Iredale High School in Texas. Or young man's hands who, when the Korean War broke out, he went and fought the war with those hands. When the war was over, he came home and he put those man's hands around his fiancée, and with those hands he put a ring on her finger. Married her, and when his first son was born, my older brother Dan, he held Dan in those hands. And when I came along a year and a half later, 3 months premature, I remember my dad said once, I was so small, he held me in the palm of his hand. And my first memory of his hands was tagging along behind him to his workshop. He was a carpenter, and we'd go in there and I'd sit down, and just big strong hand, just sand on a piece of wood, just over and over. And he'd say, now look, you got to get her flush. If you're going to do something in life, son, do your best, get it right. When the end comes, you'll be okay with yourself. And I was kind of bored, just the sanding and the dust flying everywhere. And he'd clap those two boards together and, look at here, see, this matters. At Christmas time, we'd go get a tree, and he had this big construction truck. He put up canopies, service station canopies, and he'd have the tree up there and swing those big ropes and tie it off with those strong hands, and we'd drive home. He had those big hands on the steering wheel, and this is before safety seats. I'd sit in his lap. We get home, he'd cut those ropes and drag that tree in the house, and my mom just beside herself about the pine needles in the carpet, and he'd lift me up with those big strong hands. I never once worried about falling, put me on his shoulders, and I'd put the star on the tree. I remember one time we went camping. I must have been 5 or 6, and he said, son, I'm going to take you fishing. And it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I was sound asleep. What are we doing? Pitch black. He takes me out to the Bosque River. We get to get in the river, and it's cold, and I'm sitting there shivering, and my dad, those big strong hands, he's got a little bag of minnows, and snap. I hear this snapping noise, and I realize he's putting minnows on hooks and running this line. And later in the day, we went back to the river, and there were these biggest catfish you ever seen on those hooks. And we got them off, and he took them home, and he cleaned them with those hands, just steady hands, and pumped up that Coleman stove. And he cooked those fish in some kind of cornmeal. Best fish I ever ate, ever will eat, I guess, because what I had to do to go through to get them. He loved to hunt with those hands, and he kept our home together with those hands, and kept it up. He worked so hard with those hands that sometimes I'd notice a nail would be black, and maybe where his hammer had missed. Or as I got older, I thought his knuckles were growing, getting bigger, and now I realize his knuckles, it was like marbles had been put in there. They weren't getting bigger. His fingers were getting smaller. He was working them to the bone for our family. His hands would get so dirty that he would wash them in gasoline a couple of times. And I said one time, I said, what happens if there's a spark and your hands catch on fire? He said, yeah, gas evaporates. Try it. He'd siphon gas in his mouth, spit it out. One time, he did get electrocuted. He was putting a service station canopy up, and an electrical wire touched some metal fascia or something. He got it good. I remember after that, the palms of his hands were white, and there were red tissue where his hands had been burned, and he'd been burned, But he never seemed weak to me, not a day. When his diabetes decked him, and he had to have a kidney transplant, that was the first time I could really see the veins on his hands that seemed to try to levitate right out of his skin. And he was still strong with those hands. After all of that, he built my clubhouse. I called it my office. He kept bees with those hands after he retired. If he laid his name with the city and someone called about a swarm of bees and they'd contact my dad, he'd go out and get the bees. And he built the hives, kept the bees, harvested the honey. I remember one time he grabbed Jones with both hands and tried to get my cat interested in beekeeping.
He could tell by the hum of those bees that they're not too friendly.
He's been gone nearly 30 years, and today he seems most alive to me through his hands. I can still see him. Hands that touch my life with love, and on cold, hard days, those hands can touch my heart.